of this week has been about the budget, and that was delivered last night. And I thought I might have a bit of a chat about some of the key aspects of it. First of all, the big picture is not good. It increases the national debt. It's already 500 billion. The ceiling has been increased to 600 billion. The prediction is it'll go over 700 billion. That's pretty tragic. The deficit in 2017, 2018 will drop slightly to about $30 billion. That's if all the Treasury forecasts regarding revenue and expenditure are exactly right. History suggests they won't be exactly right. If the iron ore price continues to drop, for example, the royalty revenue won't come in and the deficit will be higher. Once again, the budget is projecting a return to surplus in 4 years' time. Last year it projected a return to surplus in 4 years' time. The year before that it said we would return to surplus in 4 years. And the year before that it said the same thing. I don't believe it. I don't think anyone with any sense should believe it. And the reason is that spending is projected to increase by $3.1 billion in the next 2 years. And then they're saying, well, after that, it'll drop $3.3 billion over the subsequent 2 years. Now, in case you haven't noticed, there is a budget every year. So they're making promises about budgets that are 2-3 budgets away. And of course, that could easily be changed by the treasurer of the day in those years. So it really doesn't guarantee anything at all. In real terms, both tax receipts and spending per person will increase over the next 4 years. So there's no declines there. How do we know that? Because there's a new table that's been introduced into the budget papers as a result of my negotiations with the government in order to achieve my support for the ABCC bill. Amongst other things, this was a small concession, but I think it's very useful information, which is Table 11 for those of you who have access to the budget papers, and they are online, so you can find it for yourself. And it shows taxation receipts, non-tax receipts, total payments, cash balance, net debt, net interest payments per head from, well, in fact, it goes right back to a long way, and then continues right through to the current year, and then for the next 3 years, so over the estimates. And each year from this year for the next 3 years, both of those are going up. So that tells you gives you a bit of a clue as to the general direction our economy is heading. It's going downhill. Now, when we drill down a bit on that information, we look at tax increases and spending. And there's one other thing that I think is relevant to the big picture, and that is the growth assumptions. The budget assumes a growth rate of 2.75% in 2017-2018 and 3% thereafter. Now, we have not achieved a growth rate of that sort for some years now, in fact probably since the GFC. And there's no real reason to believe that we're going to get back to it unless China really kicks into gear and really starts to import stuff from us, raw materials, food, whatever else they need. We are not going to see growth rates like that. So returning to tax increases, there are several in the budget. One is, of course, the bank levy. I'm sure you've heard plenty about that. It is going to raise, what, $1.6 billion thereabouts from the banks. It's an additional tax on the banks, whatever you might want to call it. It's targeted only at the big banks. So there's clearly a implicit government policy, if not an overt government policy, that big banks are bad, small banks are good. Now, if they were serious about increasing competition amongst the banks, I wouldn't be complaining. I'd go along with all of that. But they're not. The way to encourage competition, of course, is to allow the big banks to be taken over, to merge, and to open up the home loan market to foreign competitors and increase competition overall, not to protect them from takeovers, not to guarantee their loans, and prevent them from merging with each other. Anyway, so they are going to be slugged with a special big tax. Everyone on somewhat higher incomes will pay an increase in their Medicare levy, and that's supposedly going to be funded to fund the NDIS. The NDIS is a bad idea that keeps getting more and more money. There were some gaps in the way in which disabled people were looked after before Labor decided the NDIS was a good idea. But it does not need a great big new scheme. It's you know, like owning a boat. It's a hole in the water, you throw money into it. That's what the NDIS amounts to. A great big program in which there will be an endless money pit. So that's the Medicare levy will increase for most people who pay tax. There will be a tax on companies, a levy it's called, on companies which employ foreign workers. That includes, in particular, the foreign workers with very necessary skills. Now that money is supposedly going towards traineeships and apprenticeships, but of course the companies that are paying that are not necessarily going to benefit. A big problem with the tax situation is bracket creep. Whenever you receive a pay rise, you get closer to the next tax bracket, and so your tax goes up once you pass that tax bracket. That's been going on for a long time now. Back in 2013, 2014, I had discussions with the former Treasurer, Joe Hockey, about how concerned he was that the impact that bracket creep was having on average wage and salary earners. Nothing's been done about it since then. There were newspaper reports about it back in 2014. You know, there was certainly a desire by Joe Hockey and Treasury in general to do something about bracket creep, to lower marginal rates of tax so that people had an incentive to earn more, work more, maybe do overtime, sometimes take a second job, that sort of thing. Of course, the higher taxes are, the less people feel inclined to do that sort of thing. So bracket creep is actually contributing an enormous amount to the tax revenue that the government is relying on. And even after bracket creep, it is still going to have its $30 billion deficit. It's still spending $30 billion more than is being brought in by all those taxes, including bracket creep. And a particular annoyance for me is that cigars and roll your own tobacco will be subject to higher taxes, yet more higher taxes. I'm a cigar smoker, and that annoys me enormously, but it's also bad in principle because, of course, a lot of people, when they see how expensive cigarettes are, not so much cigars, they're mostly smoked by middle-aged men who can afford it, but they still grumble. But rollies are mostly smoked by people who have moved to rollies because tailor-made smokes are too expensive, and now they're getting taxed more on them. The market for illicit tobacco will just continue to escalate. And then when we get to spending, there's very little that's been cut back in the budget. There's $533 million that goes for what we obviously pork barrelling. There's $300 million for competition payments for the states to basically incentivise them to increase competition in areas in which they have jurisdiction, and to reduce red tape. You know, the states shouldn't have to be bribed to do that sort of thing. They should do it just as a matter of course. There's a lot of money going into infrastructure. The Sydney airport, I probably can't complain too badly about that. It will eventually be compete with the current Sydney airport. Competition between airports is a good thing. It'll lower airport costs, charges to the airlines. Ultimately, passengers will benefit from that with lower fares. But it will be a long time before it's cash flow positive. The inland rail, I am very dubious about that. I don't think it's ever going to stack up. It's a good idea in theory. It's just that I'd be very surprised if the freight and the business it generates ever covers the cost. And yet it looks like we're going to have at least some taxpayers' money in it. And then there's Snowy Hydro. That's also going to cost a couple of $1 billion. Now, there's nothing wrong with hydroelectricity, but most of the electricity generation in the country around the states is privately owned now. South Australia is privatised, Victoria's privatised, New South Wales is privatised. Queensland hasn't, and Western Australia haven't yet, but I don't think they'll be able to hold out forever. And yet here we are, Snowy Hydro, another generator in New South Wales, also affecting Victoria. It's going to be government, or it's going to remain government owned, and we're going to spend more money on it. I have no problems with expanding Snowy Hydro, but why can't it be the private sector? Why does it have to be taxpayers' money? It's bad policy. And then we are seeing an increase in the Medicare. The offset from the Medicare increase levy is going to be paid more to doctors and less to the pharmaceutical companies. Guess which of those two has the most influence on votes? And that's really what this budget is all about. It's about votes. It's not about balancing the budget. It's not about what's good for for kids, young people, old people, taxpayers, those on welfare. It's not about doing the right thing by them. It is basically bribing them. It's basically saying all of those scary stories that you got told by Labor and the Greens and all the lobby groups and everybody else with special, with a claim on your money, with claiming we're special. That's what this is all about, is to defuse their complaints so that the voters who are influenced by that sort of thing say, okay, that problem is over, now I can go back to voting for the coalition. This is a budget designed to keep the coalition in office. Now the problem, of course, is that it's only, a matter of months, less than a year since the election. Theoretically, there are another 2 budgets to go unless there is an early election. If they're being this generous in their first budget, can you imagine what they're going to be like as they get closer to an actual election? I am horrified at the very idea.